Behind every great album is a great producer. So in this video, I'm going to talk about my top 10 choices for metal and hard rock album producers, each of whom bring their own talents to the mix. All of that coming up. Okay, so this is probably going to get a little bit nerdy, but in addition to keeping track of band member changes and differing record labels, I also take note of who produced some of my favorite albums. It's obvious to me that some producers are very well associated with specific record labels. I know I've heard of a record and I've been like, wow, that sounds so Metal Blade, or this has got to be an Earache album. And I think a lot of that has to do with the producer specifically. So with that, let's go through my top 10 favorite rock and metal album producers. At number 10 is Tom Werman. Tom Werman handled a lot of the pop metal acts of the 1980s and a lot of the sort of one-hit wonder hair metal bands of the late 80s and early 90s. Some of his classic bands are Motley Crue, Twisted Sister, Dokken, LA Guns, Kix, Poison, Lita Ford, whole lot of artists. And he was specifically chosen because he had a very mainstreamy kind of sound. I think a lot of bands were looking to him to get them to the next level. And Werman wasn't beholden to any one label. He worked for Enigma, Vertigo, Atlantic, Elektra, whole lot of labels. One fun resume item he has is that he produced the music and the soundtrack to the movie Rockstar, which is a fairly popular album and movie with a lot of metal fans, especially metal musicians, because I think the latter especially probably get the movie quite a bit. And if you're wondering what he's up to now, he's currently running a B&B in rural Massachusetts. So anyways, number 10, Tom Werman. At number 9 is Dirk Dierks. Great fun name to say there. Big producer out of Germany. He was responsible for a lot of the krautrock of the 1970s. Krautrock is kind of an experimental German music form. It's psychedelic sometimes, it's electronic sometimes, but definitely kind of experimental. Interesting choice for the Scorpions because Dierks produced most of the Scorpions, in fact all of the Scorpions from 1975 to 1988. He was their regular producer. And what's interesting is that Dierks got canned in 1988 because of his over-influence on the band's sound. That's weird because the Scorpions were at the height of their popularity. So Dierks is kind of responsible for some of that. So to get rid of him is kind of odd to do. Aside from the Scorpions, I really love his work with Accept. He handled all of the really great Accept albums, Restless and Wild, Balls to the Wall, Metal Heart, and Russian Roulette. So if you've heard Accept, you're hearing Dirk Dierks as well. So at number 9, Dirk Dierks. Still fun to say. At number 8, Tom Allom. You might know Tom Allom. He did the first 3 Black Sabbath albums, but he's much better known for producing 10 Judas Priest albums, 10 classic albums. And what's funny is that the albums he didn't produce are usually the ones that aren't as well done. And I think Judas Priest realized that. That's why they got him when they did Firepower, and he's basically the Judas Priest guy. We all know it. What's really cool is that Tom Allom is super proud of his heavy metal contributions. He talks about it in interviews. So he's not one of those guys that maybe during the 90s would be like, oh, I never liked metal. You know, the whole alternative too cool for school thing. So Allom stuck to his guns and definitely still is very proud of his metal past. And present, really. What some people might also forget is that Tom Allom worked on some other albums. He did the debut album for Def Leppard. He did Y&T's In Rock We Trust. And he also did Crocus's Headhunter album. Fantastic record. I've talked about it before. You know that. The fact that he's produced a number of debut albums from bands really does speak to the fact that he is kind of a go-to guy. So, at number 8, Tom Allom. At number 7 is Colin Richardson. Colin has done over 100 albums for a lot of death metal and grindcore bands from the late 80s to the late 90s. You might know some of his work. He's done albums for Carcass, Bolt Thrower, Napalm Death, Brutal Truth, so many bands, largely under the Earache Records label. He did do some work for Metal Blade and Nuclear Blast and Roadrunner, but Colin Richardson's really is the Earache guy. If you hear an Earache album of that era, you're hearing Colin Richardson to some degree. So, at number 7, Colin Richardson. And number 6 is Terry Date. Terry doesn't get a lot of the accolades that some of the other producers do. He's kind of a lesser-known producer, but he's done quite a bit of work that you might know. He did the first 3 Metal Church albums. He did the Years of Decay for Overkill. He did the first Sanctuary album. He's also done work for Chastain and Dream Theater and Liege Lord and Fifth Angel and a lot of other acts like that. Most recently, Terry Date produced Slayer's final album, known as Repentless. So there you go there. He's also a fairly versatile producer. He's done other genres. He's done hip-hop and grunge and alternative and other musical forms that some of us don't even care about. But he probably did them really well, I guess. My favorite albums from Terry Date are definitely The Dark from Metal Church, as well as Time Does Not Heal from Dark Angel. I think those are 2 of his best examples of metal production. If you haven't heard them, you should. Anyways, at number 6, Terry Date. And number 5 is Flemming Rasmussen. You probably know him as producing 3 very good Metallica albums, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and partially And Justice for All. We know Lars and James also produced that and monkeyed with certain things, so I'm not going to get into that. But he also did some other interesting work. He did Covenant for Morbid Angel, and he also did By Inheritance from Artillery, so he has other production credits besides Metallica, if you can imagine. Speaking of Metallica, of course, he also won a Grammy for doing One, the track from And Justice for All. He's also done work in more modern day for bands like Ensiferum and Evil. So at number 5, Flemming Rasmussen. And number 4 is Alex Perialis. Perialis worked a lot for Megaforce. I think a lot of his releases from Megaforce and other labels as well are pretty well known. He was the guy to go to if you were a thrash metal band in the 1980s. I mean, his resume is impressive. He's announced for Anthrax, Overkill, Nuclear Assault, Violence, Flotsam and Jetsam. The list goes on. It's also clear that Alex Perialis got better as he went. I mentioned in an episode of VRP, when he produced the first 2 Testament albums, that the jump from the first to the second album is pretty marked improvement. I mean, you can hear the ability got better. So there's that. Regardless of that, Alex Perialis' DNA is pretty much built into 80s thrash metal. I mean, he's a part of it, for sure. So at number 4, Alex Perialis. At number 3, Bill Metoyer. I've talked about Bill before in a couple videos. It's really strange how little online credit Bill gets. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, which is crazy, because if you really think of the bands he's worked with, it's insane. Bill Metoyer is really known as the Metal Blade producer, especially in the 1980s. He did albums for Tyrant and Slayer and a whole lot of other acts. He also did albums for Omen, Sacred Reich, Flotsam and Jetsam, Sadis, a whole lot of bands. At number 3, Bill Metoyer. At number 2 is Martin Birch. Now, depending on how old you are, you might think of Birch as the producer for Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and Rainbow and even Whitesnake. But if you were a teen in the 1980s, you're probably listening to Iron Maiden. So that's probably where you saw the name Martin Birch. He produced 9 albums for Maiden, 9 classic albums. One thing I like about Birch's attention to Maiden is that he brought Steve Harris up in the mix. Steve Harris is the bass player for Maiden, of course, an amazing bass player, probably one of the best in heavy metal. So it made a lot of sense to bring him up so you could hear him, because he deserves to be heard, as we all know. Birch retired in 1992. His final album was Fear of the Dark from Iron Maiden. So at number 2, Martin Birch. And at number 1, of course, it's Scott Burns. If you were in a death metal band in the 1980s and the 1990s, you probably would have given your firstborn just to have Scott Burns produce your record, because he was the death metal record producer for sure. And he really did record for all the heavy-hitting labels of the time. He did Nuclear Blast, Century Media, Earache, Roadrunner, Metal Blade, you name it. And of course, there were the bands, Sepultura, Obituary, Cannibal Corpse, Malevolent Creation, Napalm Death, Deicide, Death, Goreguts, the list goes on. I'm sure there were other people who worked at Morrisound Studios, but really Scott Burns is the only one I can think of. He is Morrisound Studios. I mean, if there's anyone else who worked there, okay, but it's Scott Burns. Everyone knows that. Scott Burns is now retired from producing. The final album he did was for Obituary. He did the 2005 release of Frozen in Time. So at number 1, Scott Burns. I also want to go through some honorable mentions here. The first is Ted Templeman. Ted Templeman was pretty much responsible for all of the David Lee Roth era Van Halen albums, and some of David Lee Roth's solo material as well. So he's known for that, for sure. Also, Bob Rock. Bob Rock did a lot of work with Motley Crue and Metallica. He did other bands too, but a lot of them were outside of hard rock heavy metal. But I did want to mention Bob Rock, because he is a decent producer. And I'm absolutely leaving out Rick Rubin. Yeah, I know, Slayer. Slayer's a great band with great songs, but I never thought Rick Rubin was a great metal producer. I mean, if he's a good producer with other genres, great. I don't listen to hip-hop, so I don't know. But yeah, a lot of his production is either, with Slayer in particular, is either stripped down heavily or it's just not great. So yeah, Rick Rubin is off my list. Do you have a favorite album producer whose work impresses you? Maybe I mentioned him, maybe I didn't. Also, are there producers that you know about that have a definitive production style that you can immediately hear? Let me know all of that and anything else related in the comments. And of course, remember, like, share, subscribe, and big thanks for doing that, by the way. Always appreciate the support. So other than that, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.